And good morning again. We talked to the Secretary of State as the NATO summit was concluding yesterday. She said the NATO allies gave the president's Afghanistan policy a resounding vote of confidence and that Afghan President Karzai, who has been critical, is now on board.
He is fully in support of the strategy. He is fully in support of the fact that it is making progress. But he is very sensitive, as you would expect the president of any country to be, as to whether or not, when we engage in night raids or other offensive actions, we are actually getting the bad guys and not conducting actions that result in a lot of civilian casualties. And so General Petraeus understands that, and they're working closely together to make sure that they stay in sync.
Well, that doesn't sound exactly like what he told the Washington Post just a week ago when he said U.S. forces were becoming too intrusive in Afghan life. He wanted to stop the nighttime raids, which is kind of the heart of General Petraeus' strategy. Are you telling me he's changed on that?
No, what he has said to me and to others is if you have a night raid that kills a Taliban leader, he's all for it. If you have a night raid that kills 5 or 6 innocent civilians and maybe some really low-ranking 19-year-old kid who joined the Taliban, he's asking us to evaluate whether or not that is an appropriate balance. So I think sometimes the very legitimate questions he's raising get blown out of proportion. And I think what we do in talking with him, and I do it on a regular basis, is to make sure we listen well and we understand exactly what the root of his concerns are.
Well, let me ask you, what do you say to the parents of an American 19-year-old, parents who have lost a 19-year-old in Afghanistan, when they hear that the president of Afghanistan says we're being intrusive there? What do you say to those people?
Well, we say it, and the president, of course, signs a letter to everyone, every family that loses someone in Afghanistan. We say we are making progress on the ground. That is indisputable. It's not only something we believe, the Afghans believe it, and all of our NATO ISAF allies believe it. Number two, because this is a war against an enemy that doesn't fight fairly, that is, picking off civilians, using IEDs, going after our troops, we have to be always as clear as we can that we're going after the real enemy and not just, making an offensive move that doesn't have a positive military reason behind it. But, that 19-year-old who's out on an outpost in Afghanistan is standing up for American national security interests. And maybe there is always a question when you're trying to win the hearts and minds of a population while killing an enemy that lives and hides amidst that population, how best to do it. But I think our young men and women on the ground understand that better than perhaps those who are far from the fight. So this is something we always are asking ourselves. How can we do it better? How do we protect our people? How do we protect the innocent Afghans? And how do we keep doing what we're doing successfully, which is degrading and reversing the momentum of the Taliban?
All right. Well, let's talk about the START treaty. Madam Secretary, on the president's recent trip to Asia, he was totally blindsided when he thought he was going to get a trade agreement in South Korea, and the thing fell apart. Now he is saying that getting the START treaty ratified by the Senate he's putting the highest priority on getting that done in this lame duck session of the Congress. How isn't he risking another serious embarrassment? Because frankly, he doesn't have the votes to get it ratified in the Senate right now. Why has he said this is the highest priority right now?
Well, Bob, first, I don't think those are two analogous situations. I mean, the president didn't finalize a deal in Korea because he was not satisfied that the deal was in the best interests of America. And that's what a president is supposed to do, and so he did the right thing. Obviously, he is continuing to negotiate to get a deal that is in the interests of the United States. With respect to START, there is no doubt that the START treaty is in the interest of the United States. Don't just take it from me or from the president. Look at what the Europeans, people like Angela Merkel or the foreign minister of Poland or the president of any of the Baltic countries or so many others are saying. They live next door to Russia. They know that this is in their interest, and they also know that because we have no treaty, there is no inspection going on. There is no verification going on.
He doesn't have the votes.
But you know, it's always difficult to get these treaties through. It always takes a lot of presidential effort. And we are making the case that, number one, this is in America's national security interest. Our friends and allies around the world support this. We need to get inspectors back on the ground. Remember what Ronald Reagan said when he was passing an arms control treaty with Russia: trust but verify. Right now, we cannot verify. And this is the kind of important national security agreement that the Senate needs to be encouraged to stop and really study and focus on. And to be fair, Bob, you know, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee voted it out on a big bipartisan vote. It couldn't get the attention it needed before the election. The president is saying this needs to be dealt with in the lame duck session. Senator Lugar, who knows more about arms control treaties than anybody else, I would argue, in our country probably at this point, has said very passionately, this must be done for the United States.
But do you think you can get the votes? I guess that's the question I have.
But that's what politics is about. And I have to say I'm proud of the president for making this a priority, because he's putting it above politics, which is exactly where it needs to be. He believes so strongly that this is an important treaty to get done this year that he is putting his enormous office efforts behind it. And, you know, obviously we're all doing everything we can. Now, at the end of the day, the senators have to decide. But I would hope that this treaty would be treated as others, whether it was a Democratic or a Republican president, saw their treaties in arms control with the Russians treated. And that is, this is beyond politics. Let's pass it by an overwhelming bipartisan vote.
All right. Well, let me ask you quickly about these terror trials. We saw one of these people from Guantanamo almost walk out of a courtroom here, someone who was charged with blowing up our embassies in Kenya and another place in Africa, and he was acquitted of 284 criminal counts, convicted on only one. Now, mind you, I know he's going to face some prison time. Is it time, Madam Secretary, to start rethinking whether we ought to put these people in these civilian courtrooms and think about putting them before a military tribunal?
Well, Bob, I don't believe so, and here's why. The terrorists who are serving time in our maximum security prisons are there because of civilian courts, what are called Article III courts. Our Article III courts have a much better record of trying and convicting terrorists than military commissions do. And in fact, this defendant, having been convicted, will be sentenced somewhere between 20 years and life. And some of the evidence that was presented could not be used, but the rules of the military commission, which, remember, operate under military law, similarly would be disqualifying certain evidence. I believe that the vast majority of the defendants can be tried in Article III courts, but there are some who should not be, and they should be reserved for military commissions for a variety of reasons. But I think
What about Khalid Sheikh Mohammed? Do you think he ought to be tried in a civilian court?
I think that that is a case that is a very difficult one because of all of the security issues and the other problems. There will be a recommendation made by the Attorney General. But if you look at the case that was finished last week, a lot of the counts were related to evidence that, because it was connected in some way to the use of inappropriate interrogation methods, could not be used. And as experts in military law have pointed out, that would also be a problem in a military commission.
Let me ask you one final question. There's a big uproar in this country now about this new pat-downs that are going on as people try to get on airplanes. Now, do you think that this is necessary in the war against terrorism, or should we take another look at this?
Well, Bob, I think that we have to be constantly asking ourselves, how do we calculate the risk? And you know, sometimes we don't calculate it correctly. We either overstate it or understate it. Clearly, as Secretary Napolitano has said, we're doing this because the terrorists keep getting more creative about what they do to hide explosives and, crazy things like underwear. So clearly there is a need. Now, if there is a way to limit the number of people who are going to be put through surveillance, that's something that I'm sure can be considered. But everybody's trying to do the right thing.
Okay.
And,
Madam Secretary.
and I understand how difficult it is and how offensive it must be for the people who are going through it.
Final question. My time is up. But would you submit to one of these pat-downs?
Not if I could avoid it. No, I mean, who would?
Thank you very much, Madam Secretary. All right, well, Jan Crawford, our legal correspondent, is joining us now to put a little analysis perspective on this. Let's get back to these trials, Jan. Is the Justice Department, are they still considering putting these people into civilian courts, or are they rethinking this now?
Well, publicly, as we saw in your interview just now with Secretary Clinton, they're saying they're still going forward with these plans to hold some of the trials here in the United States of some of the terrorists who are being held in Guantanamo. They haven't said which ones. Obviously, they're rethinking whether or not they're going to bring Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the mastermind, self-confessed mastermind of 9/11, into the United States after all of that enormous opposition. And they were forced to walk back, and now, of course, Attorney General Holder is studying that. Remember, it was just a year ago where he testified that they were going to do this, they were going to take this path. Failure was not an option. He told the Senate Judiciary Committee that these were cases that had to be won. Well, what the Galani verdict shows is that failure is an option. As you pointed out, he was only convicted of one count. He was found not guilty of all those other counts, the most serious charges. So it raises the possibility that these guys could come here and be acquitted. And then what?
But my sense of it is that the Congress will never let that happen, because I think in both houses now there are movements underway to cut off the funds if they try to move these.
That's exactly right. And my sources say you've got people in both the Senate and the House now, Republicans, who are drafting legislation to block these trials from ever taking place here. Listen, I mean, they were on shaky ground to begin with, these trials, and this Galani verdict, I think, may well have knocked kind of the last leg out of the table for whether we'll ever see trials in federal court here. And I think it's very important to keep in mind that whatever you say about the wisdom of trying terror suspects in our federal courts initially, a decision was made years ago by a different president, approved by Congress, to try them in military commissions. So that was the path they took. And now to change course after these guys were held down at Guantanamo without lawyers, without charges, subjected to harsh interrogation techniques, is a very difficult thing. In many ways, that train has left the station.
All right. Jan Crawford, thank you very much.